there's just something so powerfully vulnerable about LaKeith. No matter what he's playing or what he's doing in a scene, you just kind of want to give him a hug and take care of him. But funnily enough, horror and comedy kind of work very similarly in the brain. You kind of lead someone down a pathway and then you surprise them. They both do exactly that. So they're oddly more similar than one might think. And I find that, like, I've always been attracted to movies that blend horror and comedy. I sort of grew up on the Freddy Krueger movies, which I think are pretty funny, as well as quite scary. And of course, like, you know, all the great Tim Burton movies of the late 80s, early 90s. I love things like Little Shop of Horrors. I don't know, to me those sort of things sort of belong together. My last movie was a bit of a horror camp situation. So I don't really know that I have an answer to it, except that I lean in, you know? I lean into where can we juice the most laughs, where can we juice the most scares, and ideally you end up with like a 4 or 5 hour movie that you then get to just chisel away and only use the best of everything.
Is anybody else seeing this?
I hope you do too.
We're gonna fight, whether we like it or not.
The Haunting, Robert Rice's 1963 film, I think, was pretty important because I feel like the visual aesthetic that's set in that movie is clearly in the minds of the Imagineers who were building the Haunted Mansion in 1968. And especially, you know, that's a movie about ghosts where you don't see any ghosts. There are no, you know, set pieces. There aren't any action sequences or even traditional horror sequences, and yet it is so effective. Because of the production design and just the way the house is laid out and made a character. Poltergeist, to me, was also a very similar movie in the way kind of the dread is built and the way you sort of have this very much family movie that is, at least at that time, marketed to families, but has this really horror kind of tragic, crazy thing happening on the inside of it. And then there's a movie, I mean, there are a lot of movies, but the other one that I want to mention that might not be as obvious is Always for Pleasure, which is Les Blank's film about New Orleans. And so many movies kind of copy this movie without intending to, but it is one of the first documentaries, this is the 70s, that sort of explains the aesthetic of New Orleans to the rest of the world, and in particular, the way New Orleans kind of balances, like, you know, tragedy and joy. There's a sequence in particular that focuses on a funeral that takes place, and this amazing street parade that breaks out right after the funeral, which is actually quite common in New Orleans. And you see these people processing their grief in this amazing, joyful, almost hedonistic fashion, and I showed the team that quite a bit to sort of get the vibes for New Orleans and the version of New Orleans that I wanted to bring to the film.
He was tall. He had hair that was sticking out of a top hat.
Top hat.
Yes. He had, yeah.
So
nice.
like top hat.
You would pull a rabbit out of it, probably.
Eyes.
They were a bit sunken.
Deep sunken eyes.
Like a raccoon.
Beady
When they
eyes.
sit back.
Especially with an ensemble, I think it's so important for the actor to kind of bring themselves to the roles, because these are characters that, you know, it's not a character portrait in which we're sort of like unpeeling a layer each scene. It is that, but it's also kind of like the minute you're on screen, I have to be able to identify you and how you play a part in this movie. And you have to feel specific and not like a trope. It's really hard to do. So that's a major part of it for me. There has to be a kind of melding between what's there on the page and who's actually in front of us on camera. It's a huge part of it. It was a collaborative process. I mean, this is a studio movie, so, you know, it's very rare that a director gets to come into a studio movie and dictate exactly who. But one person I was very sure about was LaKeith Stanfield. It was important for me to tell a story, especially, I've seen a lot of movies set in New Orleans, and New Orleans just is kind of like a patina on top of it. You know, there's not really a sense of culturally being grounded in New Orleans. And one thing that was important for me is if I'm going to tell a story about a group of people who are a part of a town that's 85% black, that we have a black lead, and of the black actors that could play the lead, I needed somebody that would bring an audience emotionally into a character that otherwise a little sharp on the edges, you know? And I felt like there's just something so powerfully vulnerable about LaKeith. No matter what he's playing or what he's doing in a scene, you just kind of want to give him a hug and take care of him. He's also incredibly charming and funny. So he was somebody that I felt really passionate about. And you know, everybody else, it was this wonderful mix of, you know, Carmen Cuba, our casting director, certainly Disney, you know, had some people that they wanted me to see, but I was looking for ultimately these character actors that could really support an ensemble comedy like this.
This house is dripping with souls, but there's always room for one more.
Initially, it was Katie Dippold's script. I thought it was fantastic. It blew me away. I sort of, you know, wasn't sure what to expect from the Haunted Mansion, especially given that there had been another one and that there had been such a long development history. And I just didn't expect it to hit me where I lived. I didn't expect to connect to the main character the way that I did. This sort of sarcastic guy who is kind of just drifting through life and who really is not that interested in spending a lot of time with other people. I just sort of kind of related to that. and to see that he was actually covering up a deep-seated sense of grief and a need to kind of move through some difficult feelings. There's a lost father son story in there too. It just, I don't know, I was up all night laughing and crying with this script. I thought it was so beautiful, and I felt this need to protect it and visualize it and bring it to life. That's it, you know? I mean, I think that, I think when I ride the ride, and certainly when I read the script, it is that sense of not quite sure what to expect, maybe a little anxiety, realizing that you can get through some scary stuff. But yeah, that sense of, you know, a Ben's journey through feeling his emotions and finding that there is this family of people waiting for him on the other side of that journey. I thought that was a really special thing. I will say I so loved the scenes when everybody was together, particularly the scene, there's a moment where LaKeith's character kind of comes clean about why he's been so gruff and exactly what his grief is about. And all of our major characters are there, and they're all just kind of firing on all cylinders. And it's a perfect scene in that it makes you laugh, and then it makes you cry, and then it makes you laugh again. And I think it perfectly encapsulates kind of the heart of this movie and why this group of people is so just delicious to sort of watch together.
This mansion is unhinged.
These ghosts definitely don't want to leave.
Death lurks around every corner. God, give us a break.
Well, I think the big challenge with this is to, one, I feel a sense of responsibility to the fans of the ride, but also knowing where to sort of kill your darlings a bit. We pulled a lot of things out on the table. There was a lot of research done. We kind of obsessively pored over, you know, the documents that Disney sort of keeps for their rides, but also the history of the ride, the intentions, the things that didn't make the ride, the things that did, but people didn't really notice them, etc. But at a certain point in time, you can't put all of that into the movie. You know, it's not a museum piece. The story has to move you. And so the challenge is, what of these details helps us tell the story that's right in front of us? And what of these details, you know, maybe need some adapting so they can better do that? And which one of them, you know, we gotta kind of wait for another one, basically. That was probably the hardest thing. There were quite a few things that it would have been fun to have them in there, you know, especially with the paintings. I fell in love with so many of these other ghost characters, and we even shot quite a bit that, you know, it didn't really move the story forward, but I think they're all so interesting. I think every single portrait you pass and every single ghost you encounter in the mansion really could have their own movie. So it's difficult to not, you know, include more of that.
Is this the man who mugged you?
Wow! You just did that just now?
Working with Jeffrey Waldron was wonderful and kind of essential because he and I had worked together on my TV series before. So there's a common, like, we understand where each of us is coming from in terms of what kind of visual storytellers we are. And he is a phenomenal visual storyteller. He is not just passionate about the lighting, which he is incredibly passionate about, especially considering that, you know, in this cast we have people with darker skin tones, and we are, you know, shooting them against each other, and with people with lighter skin tones, and understanding that takes quite a bit to craft. But also just like, how do we tell the story, and what story are we telling, and what is the scene about? And the thing about Jeffrey that I love is that he is he shares my passion for planning meticulously, but then on the set being willing to throw anything away for a better idea. And there's just so much that, you know, I was able to trust that Jeffrey just had it, you know, because we were simpatico in terms of what the purpose for everything was, and the execution of it. That's the exciting part, because then, you know, I can pitch my idea, but then hopefully you can top my idea with something even better and more informed, but our intention is exactly the same. Scale of it, to me, isn't actually difficult. The craft is kind of the same. I heard a wonderful quote from Gareth Edwards, who said that the problems that you have on a small movie and the problems that you have on a big movie, they're just the opposite problems, but it's the same amount of problems. And with a bigger movie, you just have a lot more people to manage. There's a lot more people that you have to walk through your ideas, explain them, defend them, remind them why they agreed to them before. There's just like a lot more of that than there is before. But then of course on the other side of it, when you know, I'm planning the stretching room sequence, and we're trying to figure out like, okay, well, we'd like half, you know, a quarter of the floor to be crocodiles, and a quarter of the floor to be sand, and a quarter of the floor to be a waterfall. There's nobody there going like, we can't do that. You know, you don't have that problem anymore. But the actual craft of it is the same to me. You tell, you know, the story that you've got to tell with the resources that you have. It's the same exact, you know, process as a director.